Welcome to the Earthkeepers podcast. This podcast is for people who seek new and better ways to love and care for the earth. It's a podcast for anyone who is deeply concerned about the harm being done to the environment on a local and global level. It's a podcast that builds community and connection between people of like heart and mind, people who believe that earth care should be integrated into every aspect of life. And for many in the Earthkeepers community, that includes our spiritual practices. My name is Forrest and Inslee, and in this special episode, James Amadon and I will be looking back on past episodes, taking stock of how things have developed, and thinking forward to the future of Earthkeepers. Welcome, friends, to the Earthkeepers podcast. Welcome, friends. I'm here with my co-host, James Amadon, and today we are doing an interesting approach to an episode in that we don't have a guest. We are each other's guests, I guess. We really thought that we need to take stock of where we have come from and where we're going to, and to look at the podcast so far. We've been doing some evaluative thinking, really, and asking ourselves, where do we want to go with this? So we'll be talking about that today. We'll talk also about our own reactions to some of the episodes and maybe highlight some of the more important themes that emerged. So, James, what are your objectives for today?
I want to think about how these episodes have affected my own life and my own thinking and changed some of the things that I used to think. Also, want to think forward about how we can craft episodes that will do the same thing for our hearers, our listeners. So I think there's been a lot to cover, and I look forward to highlighting some of those with you.
When you think back to our first episode and us talking about the goals of the podcast, what we hope to achieve, where we wanted to go, do you think we've actually gotten there? Have we been true to our objectives?
If you think about our goals as wanting to serve those who would listen to the podcast and meet their needs for community, for being part of something bigger than themselves, for discovering that there were other people interested in the intersection between ecology and spirituality and faith, and wanting to learn more about who's doing that kind of work out in the world, I think we're off to a good start. It's been really rewarding to hear from people who are discovering the podcast and finding it personally meaningful, having it lead them to specific action steps in their own lives or in their community. I remember talking to someone who'd listened to our conversation with Matt Ryan about urban farming, and it prompted them to think about where their own food comes from. They lived in an urban area, and they were wondering who are the people who are growing food really nearby to them. So that connection to the sources of their food and the farmers, I was glad that an episode like that prompted that kind of thinking.
I've heard from people who have been encouraged by this idea that they're not alone, which I remember was one of our main objectives. We wanted people to feel like wherever they were, even if they didn't have people around them that thought in these same ways. I think we prioritized wanting to make those people feel like they had a home, because for you and I, that's been important, feeling like we connect to other people who share some of those values and some of the struggles as well. And I think that just helps us to be better Earthkeepers, honestly, when we know that we're not alone.
All the podcasts have been helpful to me. Right now, one that stands out is our interview with Tamina Martelli of World Relief and her work with the Paradise Parking Lots Community Garden. Incredibly inspired by how that came together, by listening to refugees in her community, what they needed in terms of connection to land and food and community, and the incredibly creative idea of that communal garden coming together on a church property. I love the image of a church deconstructing part of its parking lot to make this happen. It's been long kind of an understood principle of growing your church is to add parking spaces to make it possible for people to come. So this counterintuitive movement to take that away in order to foster a different kind of growth, literal growth of vegetables from around the world, growth in community and connections. I think it's the kind of inspiring countercultural thinking and action that we need. And that to me was incredibly thought-provoking, helped me think about Circlewood's approach, the way I live my own life, the way I understand my involvement with church, all of those things. I was really grateful for Tamina and her willingness to share that journey with us.
Mm-hmm. All the people I've talked to have had, some impact where I find myself thinking about things I've said in retrospect for weeks afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe one interview that comes to mind was with Lenore, 3 Stars.
Mm-hmm.
In particular, she talked about this idea of kinship. And her contention is that we have to see ourselves, of course, as part of the family of creation. We belong as kin. And that doesn't make us superior. It doesn't mean that we can use creation to our own ends. It doesn't even mean that we're in charge of creation in the sense that we rule over creation, but we are kin, we're family. And that's an important reorientation for me, even though I think there has been already part of that dimension of relationship with creation that I've developed all my life. And I think a lot, for example, of Francis of Assisi and his habit of calling, the sun brother, right? Or referring to the birds as brothers and sisters, as family. And it's been something really appealing in that to me. In fact, I'll confess that, even in my garden day to day, I address the plants and the birds. And so I'll say, Brother Bird, please stop eating my blueberries.
Yeah.
They don't listen to me, but they look at me with empathy and sympathy. I'm sure of it. But that's a little different. I mean, yes, I think that attributes a different sort of presence to creation around us when you look at things relationally. But what Lenore did for me was to push that even further and help me to think about, well, what is the nature of that relationship that you're indicating by addressing the robin as brother? And so that's made me think, to use the robin example, which is real, by the way. They continue to eat my berries all the time.
You're good to them.
I am good to them. But see, that's the point, right? Yeah. Now I have to ask, is there a way that I can look at the needs of that robin and say, do I have a role in helping to provide for that robin? They are, the blueberry bushes that I planted after all, but do I cover them up with a net and say, sorry, no more? Or is it possible for me to maybe find ways to preserve some of them for my family, but then also allow the birds to eat berries as well? That episode changed my relationship to Brother Robin, because while I did cover up the berries, the green berries, as they ripened on most of the bushes, I always left a couple of branches on all of them because I knew the robin would come and take them for their babies, I'm sure. So that episode had a profound impact and continues to do so, honestly.
I think for me, that episode as well challenges me to ask, why does it feel uncomfortable to address the non-human world that way?
Yeah.
What is it that has kept us from doing that? Mm-hmm. Why does it sometimes feel foolish to kind of talk to other creatures or relate to them in a way where we have more in common than not? I do the same thing, and I have to admit that you do, sort of addressing the creatures in my yard, and I know that that's good, and I know that it's right. I can't help but feeling a little strange or foolish by doing that. Fortunately, I'm at a point where I'm not going to stop. I think this is a good path to go on. But I also think even in those small examples, a larger transformation is happening where we're beginning to see the world through a different lens. And definitely Lenore has helped us do that.
Yeah. You might recall when we were interviewing Victoria Lewis, and she told that story about the Canada goose in mourning that had lost its partner goose. And that mourning, the listening to the mourning, actually triggered her to understand new things about her own life and about issues that she had been thinking about and struggling with. And, for her, that was creation speaking, it was God speaking. But I have to tell you, in the editing process, there was this part of me that thought, should I take this out?
Yeah.
Should I cut it out because it's strange, right? That she says that this came from a goose. Speaking in a way to her soul, or God speaking maybe through the goose. But I thought, no, that's that awkwardness that you were talking about. Why do we feel silly doing it? And I think it's just because our culture doesn't bless that, right? Our culture doesn't affirm that possibility of the numinous, to use Victoria's word, of the presence of the Spirit and of God in nature. We just have not grown up thinking about it on that level of detail and reality. So, of course, I included that story. In fact, it probably is the most important part of the podcast because she is modeling what it looks like to be fully attentive, to be vulnerable, to having truth invade her life from the environment. So I admired her courage for telling that story, and I admire my courage for keeping it in there.
I admire it too. Good for you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, I think that if we go a little bit deeper, particularly with Lenore, something that she helps us to see is the connections between how we treat the land and its creatures will directly impact how we treat our fellow human neighbors. If we see the land as simply a place for resources or recreation only, if we abuse the land on which our lives depend, there's a very short path between abusing the people who live on that land, whether it be the native inhabitants or your neighbor in a suburban community. Those attitudes of care and affection, I think, are intimately connected between how we relate to the wider world and how we relate to our fellow human beings.
Absolutely. Backing up from this more personal engagement, when you look at maybe the thematic arc of the podcast, what have been some of the themes that have emerged for you that have seemed significant?
I think the one theme that comes up over and over again with our guests is the way in which they understand the need to critique and deconstruct the worldviews and ways of life that have led us to such a place of destruction and hurt and pain and loss, and their willingness to explore alternatives, to reconstruct a new world, to imagine what a new creation would look like. I've been struck by listening to those that we have interviewed and that pattern, along with what's going on in the wider world, whether it's the spread of the coronavirus and the way it has laid bare some of, here in America, our cultural problems, limitations with healthcare systems, the democratic process, and other things, the continued evidence of the destruction of climate change across the planet, the racial injustice and all the protests that continue to go forward across our country, identifying systems that aren't working, that are, in fact, are oppressive, and the need to kind of take those apart and rebuild something new. All of that is incredibly challenging, inspiring, and important to me.
You know, as we think about the future of the podcast, I do want to have more of that. I'm compelled, I think, by the examples of justice, of linking social justice to environmental justice issues. I'm compelled by those to want to hear more of that and want to help people to see what are the underlying issues that we tend to ignore, you know, the systemic issues of social and environmental justice that rule our lives, and yet oftentimes we succumb to that unconsciously. So, yeah, I really am looking forward to having more guests who will speak those words of deconstruction and reconstruction. And I will say what I've appreciated so far is that so far our guests have been gracious in their deconstruction, right?
Right.
Not that they don't have the right to, you know, rage against the system and all, but so far we've had no raging, but we have had some very reasoned, thoughtful, and honest critique. We need way more of that.
And as we know, just from our work with Circlewood, this is hard work. It really is. And not only are we trying to change the world, change the system, we're also trying to change ourselves and not let ourselves off the hook. And that's hard work and demands a level of rigor and grace as well that I see in our guests. And I've loved seeing everybody, they express it in a different way, but every guest have had deep passion for this, incredible energy and focus on what they feel called to do. And in the midst of doing something that's really hard, sometimes misunderstood, sometimes meaning you're foolish before your fellow human beings, there's a deep joy that I see in each one of our guests that I think is infectious to me and kind of encourages me in my own journey. Have you felt that as well?
It's interesting that you bring that up because, as I have confessed to you, I have a problem sometimes with hope.
Sure.
Because I look a lot at the problems in the world concerning the environment in particular, I get so easily overwhelmed to the point of just wanting to give up. Who am I in my small efforts to actually make any difference? And even when I think about the bigger efforts, I just compare that to the extent of environmental damage, for example, or the projections for the effects of climate change. And I get overwhelmed, honestly. So I agree with you that somehow our guests have found ways to have hope nevertheless, right? Not naive hope. I think instead their stance is more one almost of belief in the validity of their efforts and obedience, really, as their agents, right, of social good in the world, of God's grace in the world.
Yeah. Well, I think I see in our guests, they've got kind of one eye on the big picture, and they understand sort of the systems and the big challenges we face. And then their other eye is sort of focused on right where they are, their particular piece of creation that they are trying to care for, the gifts that they are trying to steward. And I think trying to keep those in tension is really important. But when you start recognizing that there are thousands of people doing that, rather than just you or just a few, to me, that's pretty encouraging as well, because it takes the burden off of me to solve the big problem and simply do my part and be part of a community where everyone is doing their part and trusting that something really transformative can emerge out of that.
I think another source of hope is found, I think, in the fact that God is in this, right? That God knows what's going on. And I think of Christy Renaud from Plant with Purpose, and she talked a lot about that. I mean, her motive is simply that she feels in her work with agricultural development and reforestation in various countries that really the work is informed by her belief that this is God's work, right? She just comes alongside to do her part of it, but she doesn't own the whole work and she's not responsible for the whole work. Right. And I think that's very freeing.
And the alternatives are really cynicism and despair.
Yeah.
I would not be surprised if some of our listeners feel both of those from time to time, as we do.
Absolutely.
But being part of a community, hearing from others who are working through the same kind of things, I think is an antidote to that. That the hope that we are experiencing and talking with these folks is a contagious hope, one that it's unlimited. So the more you share it, the more it expands. And I have thought back to these folks in my days, the days when I feel discouraged, to think, well, there's someone else getting up and working at these hard things in their own way. And God bless them and, back to work.
One thing that I have noticed and been inspired by is really this tacking back and forth from the local to the global and the importance of keeping both in mind for balance. And I think about Matt Ryan's episode, and, he talks really inspiringly about the reasons we ought to be doing smaller scale farming and also local farming. Why is that important? He talks about the impact of shipping on the food itself, and certainly the impact of shipping on the environment. He talks about how more local, small-scale farming actually helps the land to become more healthy. It treats it well, it respects it well, as opposed to the agribusiness approaches, which really treat the land as a commodity to be used up. I mean, those are huge, important, big themes.
Yeah.
But he always linked it back to the local.
Yeah.
And talked, for example, about the importance of supporting local producers, shopping at farmers markets, supporting restaurants that source their food locally. So I loved that he was always grounded in the smaller scale, everyday community-based implications of the bigger ideas. And I think his best line, really, when I asked him, what can people do to address all these injustices?
Yeah.
And he said, the best act of social justice is to plant a tomato plant. And that was brilliant because, obviously that's not going to solve everything, but if that's where you need to start, then you should start, right? And that was his point, is just do something and be okay with doing something small and accessible and build on that, build from there. But he didn't dismiss the smallness of such an act.
No, because in that small act, you can see all of the interconnections he's talking about, whether it's the relationship that he has with his farm and those who work that particular soil, whether it's to the school kids who are coming from that area to learn, to help grow and to taste that very tomato, and the way that act can transform their own worldview and understanding of their relationship to their local place. That's where I think those small acts can become catalytic and symbolic of just the wider kind of dynamics that we're talking about. I do think that relationship between global and local is increasingly important. We often talk about having an ecological worldview in which we just understand everything is connected to everything else in ways we see and in ways we don't see. We have to be able to look at the ways we're connected and to assess whether those are healthy connections or unhealthy connections. I love the fact that we can talk with one another and share our ideas with people all over the world through this podcast and through the very same technology here back, and share ideas and know who's out there who's working on these kind of things. And at the same time, there are some global connections, whether it's industrial agriculture, whether it's the excesses of global capitalism, that are not necessarily healthy for us and our planet. So I see the need for the Earthkeepers podcast to keep teasing out those dynamics to help us understand.
Sure. I think it was significant that we actually started with Christine Sign's episode, because her approach to creation care absolutely is grounded in the local. And for her, building community is of paramount importance when she plants her tomato plant, right?
Yeah.
So, yes, she does think about the food systems and even mentions that in the podcast. She advocates shopping locally as well. But I think for her, the very act of gardening, planting a garden, is an act of defiance and resistance in some way against isolation, right? Against the atomization of community. And so I think that for her, she's quite comfortable focusing on the importance of local implications of her actions regarding creation.
You know what I loved that she said in that episode was that when you're working together in a garden, you all have to put on crummy clothes, and it completely takes away any kind of class distinctions between rich and poor. And the imagery of that and the truth of that, it struck me very deeply at the time, and have made me think about it off and on since then.
When you think about the future of Circlewood, and by association, the Earthkeepers podcast, what changes do you anticipate? What changes do you hope for? Maybe new paths to explore or new priorities we ought to foreground?
I think over the last few months, as we've put together these episodes, as we've observed what is happening in the world and participated in some of the unrest and the wrestling with kind of the issues of the day, and seeing that they have deep systemic causes that go down to the root of who we are and how we live in the world, that has inspired us at Circlewood to go back and refine and clarify our very mission statement. The new statement is that our mission is to accelerate the transformation of humanity into life-giving inhabitants of creation. And to me, that really captures what we're about, what the podcast is about, and inspires me to continue to work towards creating a demonstration center of this on within our forest on Camino Island, and also continue to build out interesting, provocative episodes on Earthkeepers and exploring other ways we can connect to the wider community around this.
Yeah, and I think that for me, that feels like a priority for the future, that we need to figure out ways to help people to be more connected than they are already. more connected to perhaps their local communities, but also to the broader global community, to have a sense again that they are part of something bigger, that they can be inspired by the good works and actions and innovative ideas that other people are living out in whatever their context is. I think that the challenge is, how does one do that in a meaningful way? How do you actually create connections that feel real, that feel significant, and that motivate us, right? So I think that will be, at least I'll call it, an area of exploration to see how we can do more of that, to give a sense of belonging to a larger cause and community that we're calling Earthkeepers as part of the Circlewood organization.
Yeah, and you and I have talked about how to build in ways to hear from listeners. And if you're listening to this and have ideas for us, either on interesting episodes to pursue or ways that we can help make your voice heard, we would love to hear from you.
And I think we should probably tell people that one thing that's under development is actually short courses that we'll be offering to people and eventually offering to everyone, wherever they are in the world, to help them to learn more about earthkeeping, about environmental dynamics, about environmental justice. So again, something to look forward to. We're still in our Genesis year, but I'm excited when I look ahead to see all the possibilities that have actually emerged as we've acted, as we've walked forward, just to see what can happen. When I think about the future, I also think about ways that we can maybe empower people more practically. I love it when people have lofty visions and big ideas or talk about systems and systemic impacts. But again, I tend to be overwhelmed by that sometimes and don't always know how that translates into action. And so I really want to be sure that we are offering people ways to think about what is their part as a part of creation, as akin to the rest of their environment. And what does that mean in terms of what they can actually do, either on their own or in community with others around them?
Forrest, you and I are a very good pair, clearly, because when I see some small action or thing, whether it's something I'm doing or somebody else, I immediately go up to the 30,000 foot level and want to make all the big connections. And the danger for me would be to stay up there and not attach to specific concrete actions and ideas and communities. So
the small things.
The small things.
Yeah. And by implication, you're saying I have a small mind. Thanks.
What I'm trying to say is that the interplay between global and local, between theoretical and practical, all of that takes a community, even if it's just you and I talking.
Even if it's just the two of us.
To keep in creative tension.
We'll be Earthkeepers together.
And you have a fantastic mind.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So thinking about the Randy Borman episode, he talks about this very dynamic. On the one hand, as a chief of the Kofan tribe, his job as a leader was to lead all of the beings in the environment around them. And so he was not only leader, protector, servant of the villagers, but he was also that for the trees and for the turtles in the river and for the river itself. It really gave him a vision for the very intensely local calling that he had on his life. But as he told me that story, the next thing he talked about was the global community, that he has helped his people to understand that they really are playing a very important part in the larger community that is the global environment. And they take their responsibilities for care of the rainforest very seriously, more seriously, I think, as they have understood the role of the rainforest in, keeping the world healthy for other people. And so he has great visions for things like carbon offsetting, right? And helping people who live in these places that are so important to the world, helping them to do their work of promotion of the health of the forest so that the rest of us can actually survive and continue to live in a habitable world. I really love the way he thinks about community at those two levels.
Yeah, this is not pie in the sky romantic thing. This is very practical about how we can survive and thrive on the earth. It makes me think about this deconstruction, reconstruction kind of arc that we're noticing. What it makes me think about is the need to deconstruct our ways in the West of relating to non-Western cultures and people. We've been trained to see our culture as having the resources, the knowledge, the wisdom to go to other places and fix the problems, to save the people. And we need to deconstruct that completely and reconstruct a much more partnership model. But even before that, to recognize that a lot of the folks that we have thought we were serving or thought we were helping actually need to help us. They need to be our teacher. We need to be humble enough to sit at their feet and not only say, yes, maybe we can meet some needs here, but recognize we have deep needs that folks like Randy and the communities that he are a part of, what they have to offer us.
James, as we wrap up, I'm wondering if there's anything that you would want to say to our listeners so far.
I want to say thank you for listening. Thank you for being part of the Earthkeepers community and the wider Circlewood community. We are excited to continue to serve you. We want to connect with you in deeper ways. We want to hear your thoughts and ideas. We want to bless you as together we continue on the journey of transformation.
You've been listening to a conversation between me and my co-host, James Amadon, as we consider where we've been as a podcast thus far and where Earthkeepers is headed in the future. To reiterate something James said, we really do covet your ideas. What would help you to be a better Earthkeeper? What topics would encourage you, equip you, inspire you? What podcast guests might you connect us to? This is your podcast, friends. So please send an email with your ideas to podcast@circlewood.online. Earthkeepers podcast explores ways in which we can change ourselves, our communities, and our cultures to help us to care for the earth in holistic and regenerative ways. Through curated conversations, we highlight the wisdom of thought leaders and change agents who are making a difference and showing us a way forward. When Earthkeepers stand together, they amplify the impact of their resistance against environmental injustice and multiply their efforts for renewal and restoration. We invite you to support us by becoming a subscriber. You can help us reach more people with our message by leaving a positive review on Apple Podcasts. And please, share Earthkeepers podcast with anyone you know who seeks a better relationship to the earth. This podcast is an expression of Circlewood, an organization whose purpose it is to cultivate transformative communities that love and care for all creation. If you'd like to learn more about the Circlewood community, please visit our website at www.circlewood.online or write to us at podcast@circlewood.online. I'm Forrest Inslee, your podcast host. Our executive producer is James Amadon. Forrest Reed is our sound engineer and the creator of our original music. Our research assistant is Rochelle Nordman. Thank you, friends, for listening. And please join us for our next conversation on the Earthkeepers podcast.